Welcome to Petroleum Follies 1. I'm Michael Lynch. This is the first in a series of lectures on oil markets, and oil economics, and especially the way that too many people have interpreted and often misinterpreted them. We will be looking in this lecture at the long-term price of oil and how people have forecasted and why so many of these forecasts have been wrong. This lecture you will hopefully find both informative and amusing. The easy oil is gone. My blood pressure goes up every time I see somebody in the oil industry show this picture of Jed Clampett shooting at some food from the Beverly Hillbillies for you youngsters out there. And up through the ground came a bubbling crude. That makes it sound like in the old days, you just practically fell out of the boat and the oil was there. The truth is much more complicated and probably better represented by books like Hell's Half Acre about the early days in the Alberta oil patch. A great read, by the way. But when you go and look at what it was really like in those days, they didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have vehicles in the early days. We're talking 1859 in the U.S. And they often use mule power. Those of you who've worked with mules know how much fun that is. And even though the oil was shallow, the drilling technology was much, much less advanced than it is now, downright primitive, frankly. But you will object. Look at how hard it is to get oil now. We need things like multi-billion-dollar offshore drilling rigs working in thousands of feet of water. Obviously, this means that it's harder and therefore more expensive. Well, not necessarily. We'll use airline technology as an analog. Airplanes are much bigger, much more sophisticated, and much more expensive than they were 100 years ago, but flying is a lot cheaper. There's two inputs here. One is the technology making it cheaper, and in the case of oil, yes, depletion does raise costs, but it doesn't mean that costs have to go up. Why do people think it's so hard to predict the price of oil? Well, in the short term, it is hard to predict. You have all kinds of political events that occur not regularly. That's the problem. They occur irregularly and unpredictably, ranging from Gulf War II, 9/11, the oil strike in Venezuela that saw production shut down for a couple months in late 2002 to early 2003, the Arab Spring, and so forth. You cannot predict a lot of these fluctuations, and they occur all too frequently. You also have the question of OPEC's production policies. Many people thought that OPEC was not going to cut production quotas last fall, and they did, which brought prices up about $10 and ruined many a clever pundit's predictions of oil prices for this year. This past year, that is. But you also have fundamentals that are very volatile and uncertain in the short term. GDP over the long term is relatively flat, but quarter to quarter it moves a lot, very frequently. That makes all these things together make the short-term price difficult to predict, almost impossible, really. And frankly, your cab driver probably has just as much chance of giving a good prediction for next year as the most informed pundit. We won't mention who that is, partly because I don't know. Longer term, though, is very different. A lot of these things that happen in the short term are just irrelevant in the long term. GDP fluctuations, weather, and such. It really boils down to supply and demand, which are heavily determined by economics and technology, and only to a lesser extent by politics. On the demand side, product taxes will change demand growth, but it's much more driven by economic growth and to a lesser extent price, especially if price moves sharply in one direction or the other. But where the supply and demand curve intersect tells you what the price is, and the supply curve doesn't move upward all the time. It is not a uniform, inevitable question or trend. Production costs rise but are offset by technology. We'll come back to that. More important is the political influence, specifically whether resource holders such as Venezuela or Iran are open to foreign investment or even domestic investment and try to produce more oil, or whether they withhold resources, which essentially takes away the so-called cheap oil and does move the supply curve to the left, meaning that the marginal or last barrel is in fact more expensive. On the other hand, we also see that resource nationalism can be reduced, and this can bring cheap oil back onto the market, as the recent reforms in Mexico show. Now, despite the notion that economics is a well-developed science, okay, some people have that notion, views about oil prices have changed over time, and you have a number of periods, or what political scientists would call regimes, where there's relatively consistent views amongst most of the so-called expert community. From before 1973, everybody assumed that prices would be flat, maybe slightly lower in the long term. After the first oil crisis, people said, oh, it's going to go back down some. But then, when you had the 1979 Iranian crisis and the prices tripled again, people said, oh, obviously, prices have to keep going up. And from then until now, with a brief interlude after the 1998 oil price collapse, people have almost always said, we are going to have higher oil prices in the long term. And the reason has to do with basic resource economics. The reason for this belief, at least. Non-renewable resources, whether it's copper or energy like coal, oil, and gas, are different from other industries. You can build a steel mill anywhere you want, and you don't run out of, car parts. They should all cost the same over time. So nobody thinks that the cost of building an auto plant or a steel mill will go up over time. But you can't have an oil well except where there is oil. You're not making the oil, you're extracting it, as many people point out. Which means as you use up the best stuff, you keep going for, as they say, deeper and smaller fields, which in theory means more effort and higher costs. This is why people tend to think of oil and other mineral costs as going up over the long term. But Maury Edelman, my mentor and probably the dean of petroleum economics in the United States, summarized the reality very aptly in a 1986 article. He said, diminishing returns are opposed by increasing knowledge both of the Earth's crust and of methods of extraction and use. The price of oil, like that of any mineral, is the uncertain fluctuating result of the conflict. In other words, oil prices don't have to go up or down. They can do either, but it depends in part, large part, of the degree to which depletion is offset by technology. So, with this transformation from belief in price reversion towards the mean to ever higher prices. We saw computer modelers gather at Stanford in 1980, Energy Modeling Forum number 6, and a comparison of, in this case, their price forecast shows that essentially people were all much too bullish about long-term oil prices. Even though prices had just tripled, only the IPE model showed a decline, and that for only 5 years. I worked on that model. It was created by Professor Nazli Shukri at MIT, and she said that she was told when she presented the forecast that we didn't understand that oil was different. One other forecast, John Mitchell from BP created it, showed relatively flat prices for 20 years. You can see here. All the others showed that the price would continue rising, and in fact the average price forecast in 2000 was roughly $150, or about 500+% too high. Our model was about 240% too high, which leaves me with the very dubious honor of bragging that I only missed it by 240% compared to others. I don't think you will ever find anybody bragging about an error remotely close to that level. But it does show that there was essentially a bias, that rational expectations theory, which argues that the average forecast should be correct, was in fact wrong. And again, I would say this was because people were informed by bad theory. Specifically, the theory put forth by an MIT professor in 1973, revisiting a 1931 paper by Harold Hotelling, pictured on the right. He was a resource economist, and he was talking about investment in, for example, a coal mine. However, this was misinterpreted in 1973 to show mathematically that oil, energy, mineral prices had to rise exponentially. Another MIT professor, my mentor, Maury Edelman, was at that conference, and he said, no, prices have gone up because a number of countries in the Middle East have reduced production sharply. Basic supply and demand. Unfortunately, Maury Edelman's argument lost traction over time, and quite a number of economists have seized on the so-called Hotelling principle or theory, even though a number of prominent resource economists have explained that it is being misinterpreted mathematically. What's even more interesting, or perhaps humorous, depending on your sense of humor, when that interpretation of Hotelling's work was made, the price had been declining for decades. It had not been rising exponentially. It had never shown such a trend. In fact, mineral prices generally do not show that trend. They tend to be mean reverting, if not declining over the long term. And those who believe in the Hotelling theory have spent decades trying to explain why the theory is correct, even though it is contradicted by reality. And you can see the application of this theory, which was interpreted later to say that prices, oil prices specifically, have to rise at about 3% a year. And so forecasters like the Department of Energy and many others again and again predicted from the current price, expect a long-term rising trend, even though, as I said, we have not seen that historically. And you can see that it generated a series of very poor forecasts. But surely you'll say, aren't these forecasts produced by scientific, objective computer models? Well, yes and no. They are often done by computer models, although not as much as they used to be. But the reality is that these computer models were not necessarily scientific or objective. Most people do not realize, but there was one particular equation generally used in these models to predict the long-term price of oil, and I have depicted here essentially the algorithm or the equation used, the relationship that was used to predict the price of oil in all of the models shown in the Energy Modeling Forum comparison of forecasts. This takes the capacity utilization in OPEC on the x-axis and then maps it against the price change from the previous year on the y-axis. And you can see that from 1975 to 1985, the points all fall along this curve, and the curve tells you if OPEC is above 80% capacity utilization, the price will rise. If it's below that level, it will tend to decline, and this looks very good, a great fit here, if you ignore the fact that 1986 is well below the curve, 1987 is well above the curve, and 1988 doesn't appear because they stopped publishing the graph when it stopped looking accurate. The reality here is that this type of equation is used in microeconomics for short-term price changes. That is to say, if the steel industry is running at high capacity, steel prices will go up. But in the steel industry, if prices go up, people add capacity and price tends to moderate. That is not true in 9 of the 10 oil models used at EMF because they all assume that you can't predict OPEC capacity based on what is happening in supply and demand, or price for that matter. The IPE model, Professor Shukri's model, was the one exception. The others all said, since OPEC capacity is decided by government policy, you can't really predict it into the future, and you must rely instead on assuming numbers that seem appropriate. That is where we go wrong. If you have a price forecast that is too high, for example, that you think is too high, no problem. You just raise the capacity numbers. If the price forecast is too low, you just lower the capacity numbers. Essentially, the modeler is able to manipulate the price, the capacity assumptions to get the price forecast they want. So that instead of being objective, it in fact reflects the wishes of the forecaster. I've referred to this as von Maelzel's ghost, which is a reference to Baron von Maelzel, who roughly 200 years ago toured with a clockwork automaton or machine that could play chess, something that was considered far beyond the ability of any of the then primitive, more or less, clockwork machines at the time. The calculations are extraordinarily complex and were only really achieved late into the 20th century. But von Maelzel was able to show this machine, and it played chess, and it played chess very well. However, it turns out that the machine was driven not by clockwork gears and levers, but rather by a small person hiding in the desk, manipulating the mannequin, which was supposedly playing the chess. Similarly, these computer models are really driven by the modeler, despite the many hundreds, even thousands of lines of code that are in the programs. But coming forward, when we hear that people saying the price must recover, the price is too low, remember that they said the same thing in the 1980s. In fact, in 1982, the price had dropped slightly instead of growing as everyone expected, and this led to people referring to it as low prices. The New York Times called it the dark side of the oil glut, treating this as a temporary phenomenon, unusual. That was the general view throughout the industry, and in fact, as the prices declined slightly over the next few years, leading up to the crash, people continued to argue that prices had to recover. We see the same when we talk about current expectations. This survey is from the Department of Energy. It's published in their annual Energy Outlook, available for free on the web. And it stands out because this was done, the last survey done before the oil price came down. It was early 2014 when the price was still about $100. What you see here is that, except for one, all the forecasts showed rising prices, and almost every point is above $100. The exception is your humble narrator, the bad boy from Strategic Energy and Economic Research, who predicted prices would be $60 in 2025 and declining thereafter. The response I got when I submitted this was, "Are you drunk?" Well, okay, it was, "People are asking, are you drunk?" I wouldn't comment on my state of sobriety at the particular moment I got that email, but I would say that this was a very sober-minded submission. And in fact, I thought it was rather odd that people considered what I thought was a fairly mild forecast to be so outrageous to make them question my sobriety, if not my sanity. And in this graph, you see the same forecast, except in the historical context. The long-term price of oil does not conform to what we see here in the forecast from 2014. In fact, if you look at the forecast in 1980, 82, 84, you will see the same kind of pattern, the assumption that the slightly lower prices would soon be reversed. And you have to say, I could very easily be wrong. I've certainly been wrong before, mostly about the short-term price of oil. But the fact that people are almost incapable of conceiving of a price which is still 2 to 3 times the historical norm in the long term is rather remarkable. And frankly, it suggests that maybe there's some due diligence lacking on the part of many of the forecasters. This especially becomes clear when you consider that 10 years earlier, most of the same forecasts said the price would stay more or less flat for the following 20 years. As I mentioned earlier, this was after the 1998 oil price collapse convinced many that the price of oil was not destined to rise forever and ever, like some kind of beanstalk. But it tells us that, for one thing, the consensus, there tends to be a consensus at any given time about long-term prices, and that is not necessarily correct, and that is heavily influenced by recent market developments. But some people would argue there is now a new paradigm which explains why oil prices have to be higher now than any other time in the past. I already mentioned the easy oil is gone argument, but people also say, well, demand is different. You have these huge countries, 2 billion population, China and India combined, which are rising into the middle class and using huge amounts of oil. People also say resource nationalism has soared, making it harder and harder to produce oil, to get access to oil resources. The energy return on energy investment is supposedly low. That's not true, but I won't go into that here. And some people say, well, speculators are driving up prices. That's an interesting argument. It's an open debate amongst economists and market experts. I would simply note that if speculators had pushed prices up above what fundamentals suggested, then people would tend to bet against them and drive the price back down to what the equilibrium is, at least in theory, as the economists say. But is demand growth really different than what we've seen historically? In point of fact, global oil demand is growing slower now than it did before 1980. You can see that the growth in demand was actually fastest when prices were low, which makes sense from an economic point of view, and that it did not push the price up. What we see instead is that since the early 1980s and the drop in price in 86, we've had relatively steady demand growth over the long term on a global level, for the simple reason that you have the mature economies in the OECD, which are seeing slow or no demand growth, even declining growth, which offsets the growth that we see in China and India. So there's certainly at this point, there's nothing to suggest that somehow demand growth in those countries is going to automatically set a floor on price or set an ever-increasing trend into the future. So the industry certainly will agree that resource nationalism is a problem and has made it harder to raise oil supply to meet demand. and been a factor in higher prices the last decade or more. But where I would certainly disagree is the notion that resource nationalism is permanent and irreversible. People point to Hugo Chavez as the poster child of resource nationalism in the past decade. Here we see him with Fidel Castro. Both of them now passed on. But people might forget another man who met with Fidel Castro and practiced resource nationalism. This is Pierre Trudeau, not the current Canadian Prime Minister, his dad, who in the 1980s wanted to kick out the foreign imperialist oil companies, that is to say American, but also conserve the country's oil and gas by keeping it in the ground. This was a policy that cost the Canadians billions of dollars in lost revenue, especially since it was reversed rather aggressively a few years later. More generally, you could see that, as the slide shows, you had a big drop in production in the 1970s from just 3 countries that sought to conserve their resources. This was a major factor in bringing prices up. And now what we have is the opposite, with countries like Mexico, Iran, and Iraq looking for foreign and private investment. Libya and Venezuela probably will do so soon, and this is sort of like saying the easy oil is back. There's no way to predict whether we'll see a new wave of resource nationalism, but it certainly seems that when the price of oil is $50, we're going to have a period where people are going to seek more volumes rather than less. Now, are costs too high to allow the price to remain at $50? As the Total CEO, Mr. Marguerite, said a number of times. Here, a quote from 2009. In 2012, at the OPEC International Energy Seminar, he specifically referred to this argument when he suggested that I might possibly be an idiot for thinking the price of oil in the long term would be $50 to $60. You can find the video on the OPEC website. But that's really a misunderstanding of how costs interact with prices, especially in the short term. This is a typical supply curve. I've taken it from work by Maury Edelman and Manoj Shahi back in the 80s, and you usually see, a long flat and then sharply rising on the right-hand side of the curve. So people tend to think of this as costs going from A to B to C to D, and then in the future going ever higher above D. The thing is, this is not from time 0 to time now. This is from cheapest to most expensive at the current point in time. The costs will not go like this. Every individual segment will move up or down depending on factors like depletion technology. This is subject to a later talk. But what happens is if the price is at D and it drops to C, you don't see the price being forced back up by the cost at D. What happens is people walk away from these high-cost projects, many of which are outliers. For example, Kashagan in Kazakhstan, which is probably the most expensive project currently underway, would simply not have been done if it had been started in expectations of much lower prices, or if people had known what it was going to really cost. So what happens then is not that the cost, that this is the marginal barrel and it sets the price, but that a lot of these barrels in here, you'll see additions to supply in this part of the curve as people find more oil in the cheaper spots and avoid the more expensive areas. You're certainly seeing that in the U.S. shale fields. Well, so how do so many people get it so wrong? There is an explanation from another defunct economist, as Maynard Keynes would say, Herbert Simon. He, among other things, developed the idea of bounded rationality, which explained that although in theory you have perfect information and rational actors, in reality nobody has time to find all of the information that's out there. Instead, people do satisficing. I would go beyond that to say people, read the headlines in the newspaper. When someone like an oil company CEO says, well, the cost is $100, prices therefore are not sustainable at less than that, This is not based on a rigorous understanding of petroleum economics. It's simply based on what he or she has heard around the industry, probably from pundits, many of whom are not that well versed with either the history of the industry or the economics. And, just again, comments in newspapers and magazines. So, unfortunately, I often hear from economists working in oil companies that they find it hard to convince the boss that they know what they're doing, as opposed to the boss's golfing buddies or the wealthy economist in the $2,000 Italian suit. I don't know what Italian suits cost, I have to admit. That's just a guess. And so this is why companies sometimes go astray. This is one of the many reasons companies sometimes go astray, but it certainly reflects a lack of due diligence. If you are the CEO of an oil company, the price of oil is very important to you, and you should have much more than just a nodding acquaintance with the idea of where the long-term price is going to be. How do you solve that problem? Well, Stanley Kubrick had an idea. Although you may recall it didn't really stick in the long run, but I agree, this is difficult. However, sometimes you just have to get your boss to pay a little attention to the facts that are important, not what's the price of corn in Iowa necessarily, but what is the oil price going to be in the long term, and what makes the price move, which most people really don't understand. So there are some very specific lessons I want you to learn from all this. Not that I can predict the price of oil to 3 digits in the year 2040, but like the sculptor who made the elephant statue by cutting away all the pieces of marble that didn't look like an elephant, we're going to try to get rid of the mistaken notions and thus leave us with a better understanding and more certainty, or at least less uncertainty, about future long-term oil prices. First, commodities do tend to be mean reverting. No commodity has ever shown a tendency to rise over the long term. Oil is the closest, and that reflects resource nationalism and the politics of oil, not the depletion or underlying economics of the commodity. But we also find that people will deny the cyclical nature, especially whenever prices go up. This goes back to Will Rogers saying, buy land, they ain't making any more of it, to the railroads in the U.S. In the 19th century, which was, we would say, a new paradigm. And, just this constant, oh no, this time is different. This time gold prices won't go back down. This time wheat cannot return to glut, and so forth. It's also it's very sad, but there are so many people out there who talk about oil prices, oil markets, and so forth, who are not really expert. They may look like an expert. The CEO of an oil company or a minister of energy or secretary in this country is not necessarily, and usually not, an expert on petroleum economics or the history of the industry, but that has not stopped many people from speaking, typically with great confidence, about what's going to happen in the oil market. So be skeptical. Don't ignore forecasts, but realize that forecasts, and especially consensus forecasts, can be very wrong. You should try to listen to opposing points of view and weigh them, judge them, not based on 3 seconds of 15 minutes speech or 35 minutes as this talk is, and certainly not based on simply Googling someone's name. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, and I hate to go against, the godfather of Republican politics, but I would say don't trust, verify. And buy my book. Thank you very much.